Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the first in TAROE Trust's webinar series on the subject of the White Paper, otherwise known as the Charter for Social Housing Residents. My name is Darren Hartley. I'm Chief Executive of TAROE Trust. It's without doubt these series of sessions have generated a lot of interest, so a really big welcome and thank you to everybody who's tuned in today. We're expecting a fair few number of people to actually be joining. This is a few words about the platform that we're using today. We're making use of Zoom webinar. For those of you that are familiar already with using Zoom through the lockdown period, then it will look quite a lot the same as those Zoom meetings that you've already been using. There are a few other functions that we've got on the webinar add-on that we're using for the very first time today. So fingers crossed it's worked well so far. The additional features that it's got is there is an opportunity for during the session for you to raise questions. Myself and my colleague Leslie will be monitoring those questions as they come in. Hi, Leslie. And yeah, we'll be monitoring those as they come in, and there is going to be a Q&A session at the end of this when there's an opportunity to chat through. There is also the option for people, if you've got a particular question, for us to unmute people so that they can actually ask the question in person as well. So there might be, depending on how keen you are to be heard, there might be opportunities to have a little bit more interaction as part of that session. Okay, we've allocated about half an hour or so for this part of the session, and then we'll move into a more interactive Q&A session at the end. But as I said, we will be taking questions throughout. We are currently recording the presentation, so we hope that everybody is comfortable with that. The added benefit of us being able to record is that it provides an opportunity for those who are unable to attend in person today to be able to access this after the meeting. And we will also, for everybody who signed up to the event, the Regulator of Social Housing, who I'll otherwise now call the RSH, has very kindly said that they're happy for us to distribute a copy of the presentation, which is going to be used during today's presentation. So there's no need for you to take notes or anything. The presentation will be available to everybody afterwards. If we get inundated with questions, we will try our very best to be able to get through all the questions. If not, though, and sometimes this does happen, what we'll do is anything that we don't manage to get to during the session, we'll look to try and distribute something afterwards to everybody who signed up to the event. So that's the kind of preliminaries. I will hopefully now move on to setting the scene a little bit before I hand over to our star attraction today. Why are we here? Well, I guess it's worthwhile looking back that without doubt, I think it's probably fair to say that we wouldn't be here today and we wouldn't be discussing the proposals of the Charter if it hadn't been for the terrible events of Grenfell and the fire that unfolded, which I'm sure is still very much in people's memories today. We heard the considerable political response to that initially, and the need to rebuild trust and confidence amongst tenants, to place residents very much at the heart of decision making. And we've seen a number of responses to that. Not least on the building safety, the government's building safety agenda. There was the Hackett report, and then we've now got a bill in Parliament called the Building Safety Bill. A lot of people have also been very critical of that process, and it's taken a long time to move forward. And that's certainly the case where we've seen there was the initial green paper, where some of you may have participated or at least remember the ministerial roadshows that accompanied that. And that dates back to 2018. It's quite a long time ago. And we had to wait as long as November 2020 before we got the final release of the Charter for Social Housing Residents, as the government called it, at the back end of 2020. There were a range of things that were contained within that, and it's going to take some time for some of those things to be implemented. One of the key components of that charter was the proposal that there will be the introduction of a proactive consumer regulation regime. What do we mean by that? It means that the regulator has had the hand, in our words, the regulator's been operating with one arm tied behind its back for a long period of time, because it's focused predominantly since 2010, except in a few potential areas, it's focused really on governance and financial viability. So we're pleased that the shackles are going to be released and that they're going to be able to take a much more holistic view in the regulatory function of landlords. So that's one of the main functions why we've got today's session, so that we can explore what that might mean in a little bit more detail, and we can hear from the horse's mouth what the regulator is planning to do over the course of the next few years in order to implement those government proposals. Of course, it's not the only thing which is included within the white paper. There are a number of other changes. Some of those changes, for instance, include a revisions to the Decent Homes Standard. That's the standards which apply across the sector to the standard of property, or at least minimum standards of property for tenants and residents' homes. We've seen increased levels of accountability and transparency and rights of access to information that is included within that paper as well. So quite a lot of change. We will also see changes around enshrined within that to enhance building safety regime. And there were also commitments to the continuation of the building programme to supply of additional affordable housing. But now I'm going to hand over, I'm going to disappear for a moment, and I'm going to hand over to Anna Furlong. Anna is the head of policy and strategy within the RSH, and she's going to deliver a presentation which explains what their plans are in light of the white paper. So delighted to have you here today, Anna. Thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say. So the floor is handed over to you, Anna. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Darren. That's great. Now, my first test will be to share my screen, and hopefully you can now all see my presentation up on the screen. So as Darren said, I'm just going to run through this presentation, and then I'm really keen to give you plenty of time to ask any questions that you might have. So thank you for having me here this morning. I'm really excited to come and speak to you and to hear what you've got to say. We are in listening mode. It's really important that we do listen to you as tenants and residents to understand from your perspective what matters to you and what's going to make this work for you. So today in my presentation, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about who we are and what we do. And I'm also going to then talk about the role that we've been given in the government social housing white paper and what we're doing to create that new consumer regulation regime. I'll then talk a little bit about how and when you can get involved in the process that we will be going through. Hiding behind the scenes with us today, I've got a colleague, Fleur, who's going to be taking notes of this session. And the reason that Fleur's come along to take those notes today is because we really do want to hear, and we want to make sure that when we design this regime, that we're listening to what matters to tenants, so that we can actually end up with a product that works for all. So this first slide, the purpose of it really is to demonstrate that we've got really quite a big sector that we regulate. So we've got over 1,600 different landlords that we regulate, and they've got between them over 4.5 million homes. So that's an enormous amount. And within that, they vary considerably between landlords that have 1 or 2 units to really big landlords with thousands of units. So we have to make sure that we consider that in our approach, and that we make sure that it's appropriate to everybody. So this shows some of the key players within the social housing sector. And I haven't picked out all of them because there are lots, but I've tried to pick out the real key ones that come across in the government's social housing white paper. So starting at the bottom, we've got the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. Now that's quite a mouthful. So they're quite often referred to as MHCLG. And they have a really important role of setting the legislation that makes organisations such as the Regulator of Social Housing exist. And they also set the rules about what we're allowed to do as an organisation. And they direct us on a number of different issues. So for example, our role in relation to rents, we don't set those rules, the government does and MHCLG does. And then they direct us and tell us what we must do in those areas. So they're a really key important player for this sector. The Housing Ombudsman is another really important organisation, and perhaps an organisation that you as residents and tenants have more of a relationship with. So their role is to help resolve individual complaints between residents and landlords once the landlord's process of complaints has been worked through. And the Ombudsman also does a number of thematic reviews over time. And they do that because it's really important that everybody learns from the experience of others and don't repeat the same mistakes again. So they're a really important part of getting those messages out there and learning. The other organisation that's named within the white paper is the Building Safety Regulator. Now, the Building Safety Regulator is a new organisation. It's currently being set up, so it doesn't exist as a fully functioning regulator yet. And that organisation has been put within the wider organisation of the Health and Safety Executive. The role of the Building Safety Regulator will be to ensure that the safety within high-rise buildings. And they'll oversee the performance of those landlords with respect to those high-rise buildings. So we're really clear that if we're to do our job as Regulator of Social Housing, it's really important that we've got a good relationship with those other bodies, and that it's a seamless environment for tenants of knowing where to go and who the right organisation is for dealing with particular issues. And I'm going to go on now to talk about our role in a little bit more detail. So, as I said, our role is set out in law. And we have 2 main roles. Firstly, there's our economic role, and then secondly, our consumer regulation role. So in our economic role, the main thing that we're here to do is make sure that housing associations and other types of providers are financially stable, that they've got the money to do the things they need to do as landlords, and then to ensure that they're well managed in the way that they do that. And it's so important because if the money isn't there, then the quality of the services and the outcomes to tenants won't be there. So we do that in a range of different ways, and we have what's called a proactive role in this space. So that means that we can go out and ask those providers to give us information, to give us data about how they are performing. And then we can go out and we can assess them, and we carry out what we call in-depth assessments, where we go and we visit those providers and we assess how we think they are performing against our standards. And a fundamental pillar of our approach is that when things go wrong, it's the landlord's responsibility to put them right. We will help them and we will give them support in that process, but it's their responsibility. They run their businesses, they need to take the action. We do have powers to step in when landlords can't, but we really try and achieve the best outcome for tenants in our regulation. And the way we think that that is best delivered is by helping those landlords deliver that change for themselves, so that it can then continue on into the future. So moving on then to our consumer regulation role, here our role is different, and Darren referred to this already at the beginning of the presentation. So we've got a more restrictive role in respect of consumer regulation at the moment. What we try and achieve with our consumer regulation is ensuring that with the quality of the accommodation provided and the services that are received are good, and that tenants can and have the information available to hold their landlords to account. So our reactive role in this space at the moment is that where we find a breach of standard, we then have to apply what's called the serious detriment test. And that test is in law. So that means that when we find a breach of standard, we then have to test against whether there is a risk of or actual potential harm to residents as a result of that failure. Where we find that that is the case, we can then step in and take action. Where that's not the case, at the moment, we can't. And that's something that the white paper was clear, that's what's going to change in the future. So the social housing white paper itself had some really strong commitments. And I think one of the key themes that runs through all those commitments is that the real importance of the relationship between the landlord and tenants. And the importance of transparency in the treatment of tenants in that relationship. And there are a number of different things that the white paper said was going to happen. So there were things for the Ombudsman in there about the approach to handling complaints. There are things for the building safety regulator in there about what's expected of them in managing the safety of those high-rise buildings. And then for us, as the regulator of social housing, our role is in terms of enhancing our existing consumer regulation role and bringing forward a proactive consumer regulation role that will help make a difference for tenants on the ground. So what we've come up with is a series of 3 tests that we think we need to meet in designing the enhanced consumer regulation role. So those 3 tests are, so first of all, we think it absolutely must make a meaningful difference to tenants. That is at the heart of the white paper, and that's what we're all trying to achieve with this, making a meaningful difference. We then also think it must be deliverable by landlords. And the reason we think it must be deliverable by landlords is because we think if it's not deliverable, then we won't be able to meet that first test of making a meaningful difference to tenants. And then thirdly, we think we also must be able to regulate it effectively. If we can't regulate it effectively, we can't step in when things go wrong. And we think that is a really important pillar. So we are aiming to meet all 3 of those tests in the design of the new and enhanced consumer regulation regime. So what will we be doing? It's important to say that this change will take time. We do need a change to the law to allow us to take on this enhanced consumer regulation regime. And it does take time to get law through the Houses of Parliament and the various committee stages that it needs to go through. One message that we have been giving landlords already, and we will continue to give landlords, is that you don't need to wait for a change in the consumer regulation regime to deliver the change and start making those changes and enhancing that relationship between landlords and tenants on the ground. And that's what's going to make the difference. It's the change in culture that's going to make the real difference. Having said that, from a regulatory perspective, what we're going to be doing is we will be going through and changing our consumer standards that we have. So those standards are really important. They are the foundations and the building blocks of the regulatory regime. And those standards set out the expectations and the outcomes that providers have to meet. We think really strongly, if we get those standards right, then the rest will follow. The other thing we will be doing is we will be going through a period of work to work out how we should best approach, how we check whether landlords are meeting those standards, and how we respond if they're not meeting those standards. And we're calling that the development of our operating model. We'll also, the white paper tasked us with coming up with a range of tenant satisfaction measures that will help tenants hold landlords to account. Now, those satisfaction measures, you may know them better as key performance indicators or some such name like that. And I'll come on to talk about those in a little bit more detail in a minute. And we are really aware that it's so important as we go through the phases to design the proactive consumer regulation regime that we listen. And we listen really hard to a range of different people who have an interest in the outcome. And you being here today is a start of this process of listening to what residents and tenants think. We will need to listen to landlords, and we'll need to listen to some of the other stakeholders that we have. And we plan to test our ideas and our proposals before we make any decisions on how this works going forward. So as I said before, the consumer standards are so important. They set the rules for the game for everybody. And we've got a number of standards already in the consumer space. So we have standards around the home, the quality of the accommodation. We've got standards around neighbourhood and community. We've got standards around protecting the tenancy rights of tenants. And we've also got expectations around the involvement and the empowerment of tenants. And the process that we want to go through it's really important that we don't completely throw out everything we've got. We think some of the standards are really good and really do get to the heart of what we're trying to achieve. So it's important we keep those things and we understand from different stakeholders' perspective what those things are. But then it's also important that we reflect on what the white paper says and what it's trying to achieve. And we change those standards and we enhance them where we think that's appropriate. When we set our standards, we think it's really important, because of the size of the sector that I talked about at the beginning of this presentation, we think it's important that we stick to a principle where we set the outcomes that providers need to achieve. By doing that, it should allow for the wide range of different types of providers to meet those outcomes in a way that best suits them and their residents and their tenants. So that will be an important part of our consideration as we go forward. It's also important that we keep an eye to making sure that our standards are clear, people understand what's expected of them, and that also we can enforce them. We need to be able to enforce when things do go wrong. And then in terms of our work to determine how we should go about checking whether landlords are meeting these new standards, in the development of that model, there's quite a lot of questions we need to consider. So we'll need to think about things like, what evidence is it that's important to help tell us whether a landlord's meeting those new standards or not? We'll need to think about, should there be a different approach for landlords of different sizes? You know, like I said, we've got very small landlords, we've got medium-sized landlords, and we've got very large landlords. Does a one-size approach fit, or is that not the right thing? Will that not lead to the right approaches and in the outcomes for tenants? And it's worth reflecting here is, in law, we do have a number of things that we have to really consider hard when we're coming up with the regulatory regime. One of those is we've got a duty to be proportionate in what we do. So we can't go and do things that aren't appropriate to the level of risk that presents itself. The other thing that's also quite important is we have to minimize interference. So we understand that providers are their own businesses. They have their own structures for governing their organizations. So we should only intervene where it's appropriate to do so. Then we need to think about, what kind of action do we need to take if landlords are not meeting the new standards? And there are a range of different powers we've got, and we'll need to consider how we use those powers to achieve the best outcomes for tenants. And that's what we'll always be testing against. How do we get the right outcome? How do we get change, and long-lasting change, not just change to meet what the regulator is saying you need to do now, but change that will go on into the future. And then we'll need to look at, how can we make sure landlords put things right when they go wrong? At the moment, in our economic regulation role, we ask landlords to come up with a plan. And I think that plan is really important for landlords owning that process of putting things right. So we'll need to think about what's the best solution for us in the consumer regulation space as well. And then lastly, but probably most importantly, we need to also think about how we include tenants in this. How do we hear the voices of tenants about what's working for them in respect to their landlord and what's not? We don't have any predisposed ideas to this. We're trying to come about this from a point of view of really listening and involving people on this journey as we design the new regime. So earlier, I did refer to the tenant satisfaction measures that are set out in the white paper. And the white paper's got quite a lot of measures in it. There are 24 different measures that it sets out, but it's also tasked the regulator with going away and working up the measures and coming up with an appropriate suite of measures. So we are going through that process at the moment. And these measures have two main purposes. So firstly, the government in the white paper saw it's really important that they're used as a tool for residents to hold their landlords to account. So they need to be able to provide information that's useful to tenants and residents and that actually helps them in that process of holding them to account. Secondly, for us, it needs to be a useful regulatory tool. So we need to be able to use the information here in our regulatory regime to understand how well providers are doing against our standards and the rules that we set. So there are 6 themes that the white paper says that we need to create tenant satisfaction measures within. And we're thinking about a range of different challenges in this space at the moment. We think it's really important that whatever the measures are, that they do meet both of those 2 aims that I spoke about. But also, we're quite aware that there is the potential for some of these measures to perhaps create perverse outcomes. So create an outcome that wasn't the intention and actually isn't helpful to anybody. So we're trying to keep a real eye to that and making sure that they're meaningful and they help develop the social housing sector and the culture in the sector, rather than create a situation where landlords only work to those measures and those end up not being the things that are important to tenants and residents. We're also working through quite a lot of detail on these measures to help us understand how they're going to work for different types of landlords. So we have, for example, housing associations. We also have local authorities. So we're trying to understand how these measures work and can be made appropriate to different types of landlords and to different sizes of landlords who've got different levels of resource that they have to be able to do these measures. But we do think it's also quite important that we do prescribe in a certain level of detail how landlords need to go about collecting the data and reporting against these measures, because we do think it's important that tenants are able to look at their own landlords and to see how they're performing against other landlords. So, as I said earlier, it will take time for the new enhanced regime to be developed. And one of the main reasons for that is we do need a legislative change, and legislative change takes time. We also think it's really important that we get this regime right. We take the time to talk and engage with people to get the future regime right. Having said that, there are a number of things we are already doing. So today is the start of us going out and talking to different stakeholders and starting to hear some of what matters to you. We will continue that all throughout our work. Later this year and into early next year, we'll start the conversation about our standards, so the rules of the game, and try and understand from people of what we have now, what works well, what should we keep, and what doesn't work so well. And we'll also be keen to hear from people about what's important to you in that future suite of standards that we have. The other thing we will be doing later this year is we'll be carrying out a full consultation on the tenant satisfaction measures. So that means we'll be publishing on our website all the measures that we propose to introduce. We'll also be publishing information on how we expect landlords to go about collecting the data on those measures and how we will use that data in our regulation. So we'll be publishing that on our website. We'll also be asking a series of questions to people to help us understand whether the measures are the right ones, whether the approach is the right one, and whether there are any issues that we need to understand. And we'll be asking as wide a range of people as possible to engage with us in that consultation. We'll also be carrying out a series of webinars and conversations with different stakeholders during that period to help us really hear those views and take that into account. Then once we've digested everything that people say, that's when we will be coming to a view and we will make a decision on those tenant satisfaction measures. So it's really important to say we won't be making any decisions until we've heard all those voices. And there will be a number of ways that you can get involved in the future, and we'll be providing information about that at a later date. But it will involve, you can sign up to an email alert that will tell you about what's going on, when there are things that it's important for you to be aware of, or where we might want to have your engagement. But as this takes time, we think just keeping that conversation and making you aware of when is the right times to get involved is quite important to manage the period of time before full introduction. So that is the end of my kind of formal presentation, so to speak. I can see already that there's some Q&A questions come up, which is great. I really welcome as many questions as you want to ask. I'm here for you today, so it really is your time to make the best use of having the regulator here today. Darren, shall I stop sharing my screen?
That would be great, Anna. Yes, please. Thank you. And thank you. Hopefully this is all still working. Right. Thank you very much for that. That was a very comprehensive overview of where things stand now. And it's been great to see that there's been a whole host of questions that have been coming in as you've been talking. So I think without further ado, I'll move over to those. I guess the first one is a question which you touched on at the end, which was very much around timescales. Obviously, we can see here that question there from Mick was when will we see things start happening apart from on complaints? And I guess what Mick's alluding to there is that there has been quite a lot of change, quite a lot of activity on the Housing Ombudsman side. There's the residents panel that has been set up. Obviously, what you've been talking about today is a lot more far-reaching. And I note for those that might not have seen, in the Queen's speech last week, which kind of set out the timetable for what legislation was going to be coming through in the next parliamentary session, there wasn't anything around the white paper included or allocated time. A couple of little things housing related, but nothing which suggests that the white paper itself was. Obviously, you'd set out an anticipated timeline there. Was that developed on the assumption that there might be time allocated in this session, and the fact that it's not in there, will that have any impacts on that timeline at all, Anna?
I mean, the timeline that I put up there is the timeline we are working to. We're still working to that timeline. We think it's really important that measures such as the tenant satisfaction measures actually take a really long time to implement. It takes a long time to change systems, to then have a year's worth of data collection, to then give us that information that we can use. So we think it's important that we get on with that, and we can get on with that. So we will continue to get on with that. And in terms of the legislative time, I mean, that is a matter of for government. It's not something we have any control over. There are things, the full regime can't come in until we get legislative change because of the change to our role that is needed in that. But I think if I get any message across to landlords and to residents and tenants to be able to talk to their landlords about, is that actually a lot of the stuff that's in that white paper, change can start happening now. You don't need to wait for the full regime to be up and running to start those conversations and to start the sort of period of culture change that is needed to make this work. And we really are telling people, don't wait for us. You know, we'll start those conversations. We'll be having those conversations. We'll be keeping that momentum going in terms of the importance of getting the regulatory regime right, but it won't stop landlords being able to actually make change and real change on the ground.
That's great. Anna, are there other certain things which you can implement anyway, regardless of legislation? Is there anything within there that you can move forward on?
So, I mean, that is one of the reasons we are moving forward with the tenant satisfaction measures, because we can do that without legislation. So we are moving forward with that. I guess one thing that's quite important for us is that the regulatory regime is coherent. It really makes sense as a package. So we think it's quite important that we don't sort of do things too piecemeal, because actually we think there's a risk we won't create the right outcomes then. But we are, you know, we will, and we are doing what we can in the meantime to implement what is possible, and the TSMs is the start of that journey.
I know that question came from Mick Daniels, and I'm going to just ask Mick whether we've covered everything on there. Can I allow Mick to talk? Hi Mick. I think you're on mute at the moment, but have we addressed it? I know you've got some other questions too, but if you wanted to join in.
Yeah, can you hear me, Darren?
Oh, we can hear you fine. Thanks, Mick.
No, sorry about what my concern is. I've been involved with tenants and residents for quite a few number of years, but in Sheffield, I don't know if other places are the same, we can't seem to get younger people involved. And do these people actually know what's happening? That was one of the reasons I asked one of my questions I sent in, if there was anybody else from Sheffield, because there's a sort of, only myself seems to go to these webinars and TPAs and stuff like that. Was it Nick Bliss that used to run TAROE at one bit? I can go back that far. But from what I can gather, the people that's sort of got a bit of passion are now getting to the older end, and we can't seem to get youngsters involved. Have you any ideas how we can do this and how we'll get listened to?
Great question, mate. Just on Nick, I think Nick's a good friend of ours, but he's at the Confederation of Cooperative Housing. But he's a good chap. I'll come across to Anna first, and then maybe we can come in with some other responses ourselves on that as well.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks, Mick, for your question, because I think it's a really important point and something that we're really aware of, and I think government were aware of when they were doing the green paper work and the white paper, and I went along to a few of those green paper workshops, and I was really pleased to see, actually, I did see some younger faces in the room, and I think getting those messages out there will really help to explain to younger people why it is important. And I think that's part of the culture change, and it will take time to get that culture change. And I know in the white paper, the government committed, one of the things they committed that they will do is have a kind of opportunities and empowerment programme for tenants and residents. And I don't have any information about that here today because that's the government's taking that forward, but I'm really hopeful that things like that will help to increase the diversity of people that are engaged with us. And I think through our work, we are going to be trying to reach out to a range of different organisations that might be able to help us reach a diverse range of tenants, because we recognise it's a real issue.
Leslie, did you have any thoughts on that too?
Yes, I've just raised my hand. Now I'm going to lower my hand. Yeah, I mean, I think that the one thing that has been a huge game changer is in the whole lockdown has been the agile ability to do these kind of things. And I think that, I mean, I just delivered training to a scrutiny group, and we did one on a weekday and we did one on a Saturday morning. And I think that being able to work more agilely, younger people tend to be working during the day or have childcare commitments. So I think with online and being able to be remote, I know that during the road shows that I was involved in, having to get childcare. I'm a single parent, to kind of travel down to the ministry building. Now we can just do webinars. It's made it so much more easy for me, and I'm really hoping that obviously face to face, we all love face to face, and I think face to face is really important. But I think if people are all over the country and are scared to travel or not able to travel due to different, either being disabled or childcare commitments, I think there's going to be a lot more combined working and looking at innovative ways to get tenants to become involved. And I think it's a huge piece of work. I mean, I think it's right. I think younger people, their views are important too, because they're going to be living in social housing, for like a longer time.
Yeah, sure. I get the point. We've been getting some chatting as well around that, about how it's really important to try and get kind of a range of views, and for those views to be representative. I think the other bit that I would add, which we sometimes would note, is sometimes people's views might not necessarily be representative, and some of our work deals with for instance, complaints. Somebody's really might have a really negative experience, which perhaps isn't representative of the wider tenant population, but just because it's not representative doesn't mean that those individuals haven't had a really rough deal, and warranted a much better service, and things need to be improved and safeguarded against it. So I guess it's kind of a point which is part of kind of the downside of democracy, is that minority groups, those interests need to be protected, and the sign of a really good democracy is ones that takes into account and protects those vulnerable groups as well, isn't it? So I guess we need to make sure that those minority groups' voices, albeit not representative, are definitely still heard there. And I think it's incumbent on the culture of an organisation to be able to make sure that is central to that organisational culture.
And I also think, kind of following on from that, is that when I was working at Sohar Housing as their policy and research officer, one of the questions that they asked was, in their satisfaction survey, was, even if you don't want to be involved, are you happy that other people are involved on your behalf? And that was one of their highest scoring questions. Now, I don't want to be a school governor at my children's school, but I am really happy that there are other parents that are willing to step into that role and represent me on my behalf. I don't want to be a councillor at my local district council, but I'm really glad other people are there acting on my behalf, and I know how to access them and give them views if I feel strongly about something. So I think that while there are people that can have a lot of impact, when I was involved in scrutiny, for example, I put a lot of work in. It took a lot of work. And there are people that have ability in their lives to donate that kind of, volunteering. And I think that if that measure was to be looked at, within a kind of measurement type of, are you happy that, if you're really, really busy working and you're not able to do volunteering, are you happy that other tenants are volunteering on your behalf? I think that would be something really interesting to ask. I mean, I don't know what anyone else thinks, but.
That's great, Leslie. I'm going to move things on, but I guess what that also highlights is that the real value of the people that do put themselves forward. Sometimes it's about those people's commitment of time is the exceptional. That's perhaps not the normal, but it's those exceptional actions which is what makes a real difference. I'm aware that there are a few questions that have come in which are kind of along the same sort of lines. So we've got different types of landlords that are going to be regulated, Anna, by the regulator. So we've got the kind of those that have less than 1,000 properties, which are often classed as small landlords. and have often been regulated differently to the large landlords. We're also seeing, there's already been some change, and there'll be some further change there, about the difference in regulation between housing associations versus, say, local authorities, where you've got that additional kind of councillor element to that which adds a whole other layer of complexity. I guess, will your regulatory approach take into account to make sure that it's effective and therefore makes a difference, to meaningful difference, I think was your wording, to tenants within each of those different types of landlords? So for instance, if it's a small landlord, will they still get the kind of inspection visits? Or if it is a local council, how will you deal with that versus with it, which is obviously very locally based, versus, say, a national organisation, housing association that perhaps has properties spread right across the country?
Yeah, and I think that's a really important question, because there is a real diversity within the sector, and we're really conscious of that. It's probably worth saying up front, I don't have the answer to that question yet, but it's probably a good thing we don't have the answer for it yet, because it's something we need to think about, and we need to listen and design the regime appropriately. So the white paper in terms of size of different organisation, the white paper says that we have to do inspections on providers over 1,000 units on consumer regulation. And we'll need to think about what is it that we do, what is appropriate to do for smaller providers that is appropriate to the capacity and size of their organisation, but still achieves the right outcome for tenants. So that will be what we're doing and what we will be working up as we're thinking about our operating model. And then in respect of local authorities, what I omitted to say in my presentation, so I'll say it now and get it in here. So we have a different role for local authorities than we do for other types of providers. And that is that we don't regulate the governance and financial viability of local authorities. Now that makes quite a big difference for us. And we'll need to think about how that means that the consumer regulation regime will work. One of the pillars that we have for our economic regime, and we have it for our consumer regime as it is now, is that the standards apply to everybody. Everybody has to meet those standards, and that doesn't matter whether you're a small provider, a medium provider, or a large provider. You have to meet those standards. The difference comes in respect of how we will go and check whether those providers are meeting those requirements. And we need to make sure that that's appropriate to the size of the organisation. And we will do that, and we'll have conversations with people about how we do that along the way.
Great. I guess one of the safeguards that maybe tenants and residents might be thinking around there is that if there are particular high levels of dissatisfaction, for instance, amongst the tenant population with their landlord, whether there are options to raise that with the regulator, and whether that might initiate, albeit it might not be part of your standardized approach to kind of the consumer's equivalent of the in-depth assessments, whether there would be something that might be triggered where, for instance, there is a certain threshold reached of dissatisfaction or numbers of complaints or so forth.
Absolutely. So in our current approach now, we carry out what we've called this reactive consumer regulation role. So that means that we're able to respond where there is a significant issue and it's appropriate for us to respond. And without kind of second guessing how we design the regime, I can imagine that we will continue to always have a responsive role to incidents and issues as they arrive. And that will be regardless of the size of provider, because issues will arise. The important thing for us is that, we aren't the agency to deal with individual issues. So we need to keep ensuring that we're looking at, is this a one-off incident? What's the impact of that incident? Or is this something that is a reoccurring issue? And in terms of some of the sort of, satisfaction issues, that's exactly the information that the tenant satisfaction measures will be telling us. And given that our standards apply to everybody, I can envisage that everybody, regardless of size, will be required to do those tenant satisfaction measures. So we will have various pieces of reactive information that will tell us, aside from the period of inspections, the white paper says that we need to do inspections once every 4 years. So there will be a period of time in between inspections where it's really important that we are gathering reactive information and we are able to react to situations and issues as they arise.
I guess the other point, which goes slightly outside of the RSH, but is the role of the Housing Ombudsman that you alluded to not being your role to deal with individual complaints. Obviously, that fits within the role of the Housing Ombudsman, but we have learned, and already, that there is a memorandum of understanding between the respective organisations that if there are a series of complaints from or about a single landlord that suggests that there might be systemic issues, then it's our understanding that that could be raised with the regulator, and that in itself may trigger further investigations.
Absolutely. So we get what we call referrals in from a range of different places, and the Housing Ombudsman is one of those places. And we have this memorandum of understanding in place, but that's a piece of paper. The real meat is we meet with them regularly. So we have an ongoing conversation with them where they can sort of say, right, we have got this issue, or we've got a potential issue that might be coming your way. We will share intelligence about that. But yeah, we can take referrals from the Ombudsman, and we do take referrals from the Ombudsman because they're a really important source of information. But we can also take referrals from a range of other different sources too, and we do take those. But as I say, we're not here to address individual complaints, but we do look at all those referrals, whether they come in from an individual or they come in from a representative of an individual or from an organisation themselves. And a number of our registered providers do refer themselves to us because that's an important part of the relationship we think that landlords should have with the regulator. And we'll always look at those and try and understand, has there been a breach of the standard? Is it a systemic issue? So is it an issue that's going to potentially be not just a one-off, but a widespread issue? And we'll always take action when we find that is the case.
Yeah, just a comment that's come in at the end, which is related to that point, is probably worthwhile just picking up from Alan C, who said about surely all landlords must conform with the same standards irrespective of size. And I suspect, did you want to comment anything on that in particular?
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what I've said, in that all providers have to meet the standards. Doesn't matter who you are, doesn't matter what type of landlord you are, the size of the landlord, you have to meet our standards. The differentiation we make in size is purely in terms of how we'll go about checking that and how we'll go about collecting evidence. But the bottom line is everybody has to comply with our standards. And those standards we don't have different standards for different sizes of organisation at the moment. And it's an important point for landlords to realise. They're there now, they have to be complied with.
Yeah, I suppose that leads on to the question about capacity, doesn't it? With fees, obviously now you collect fees, and those fees are different. They're a little bit different, I think, aren't they? If you're larger or smaller. I suppose another way of looking at it is that if you find, once you get into this, that the resources are not matching the kind of role that has been set out. Presumably there's something which might be, it's not for you to decide. I know it's for others to decide on the fee levels, but presumably that could be something that could be looked at as part of the wider function.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we will need to increase our resources as an organisation to be able to take on the expanded role. And that's a conversation that we're having with government at the moment, who currently pay that part of our budget. But the conversation with fees will I mean, I don't know what government's intentions are in this area, and we'll await to see what that is. But it is important that, you know, these changes do need resources to be able to happen, and that's not just for us, but it's also for landlords as well. It will take some resource and capacity to build this.
Yeah. So we've talked a little bit about the standards there and how they apply to everybody. I'm going to sort of amend a question we've had from James Temple really here. Is that presumably, will you be naming and shaming of those people, those landlords that fail to meet the standards, and action is taken against them? There's a bit of that already, isn't there?
Yeah, so one of the questions we do need to look at in our work to design the operating model is the transparency element to it. So, you know, we at the moment, we do publish on our website, whereas a provider is not compliant with our standards, we publish that information on our website. And I would anticipate that we would continue to do that. It's really important information for people to have. We also publish at the moment for our economic role or where we see issues within our consumer role, we issue what's called gradings under review. So that's where we think there's an issue that we're investigating. So we're letting you know we're investigating something, but we haven't yet come to a decision. One of the questions we'll need to look at, and we're not going in with a sort of predisposed answer, is whether we have any kind of gradings for providers on our consumer side. So at the moment on our economic side, we issue gradings for governance and viability, and we grade people from 1 to 4. 1 and 2, people are compliant, 3 and 4 are non-compliant grades. And we'll need to have a think about whether that is appropriate for our consumer regulation role or whether it isn't appropriate for our consumer role. But regardless of our decision on their, you know, being transparent with people when their landlord's not compliant with regulatory expectations will be really important.
That's great, Anna. I'm aware of time. I think we're okay. We're going to try and fit it all into just over another 5 minutes. I think if we do one kind of more substantive one, then maybe do a few quick fire ones, if that's okay. I'm going to kind of wrap up a few about the kind of the complexities of tenant involvement and engagement as a challenge in itself. Obviously, there's a particular standard there about tenant involvement and engagement. I guess the first part of this question is going to be, presumably you will be looking at reviewing that as part of the broader, because that's one of the consumer standards. You mentioned that you'll be looking at the consumer standards, so presumably that's up for grabs in terms of something that is going to be for review. And I guess some of the comments that we've been getting in here, and actually is reflective of some of the comments that we get more generally, is that there was nothing in the charter around an independent voice for tenants generally. And I think what our experience has been is that a lot of independent tenant associations have gone by the wayside in recent years. And therefore the tenant voice has kind of been channeled through the landlord. I'm not saying that that doesn't still have benefits as well. I'm sure it does. But I guess if you're looking at engaging with tenants to find out about their experience as part of your proactive consumer regulation role, is there anything that you can maybe do to safeguard so that the views of kind of independent tenants, maybe those that are not otherwise engaged, there might be opportunities in the kind of the methodology that you adopt that means that tenants who are not routinely involved with their landlord and perhaps cherry-picked, or to have their voices heard as part of your role in the future?
Yeah, so I think you were breaking up for me slightly. I don't know if others had that through that question, but I think I got the gist of it. But tell me if I am answering on the wrong lines. So I think you were sort of asking about how, you know, there's a tenant voice in it, and there are a number of different tenant voices, but some of the independent voices and the mechanisms for getting those independent voices, you know, there was nothing in the white paper to set out sort of mechanisms for that. And that's right, you know, there wasn't. And I think from a regulatory perspective, and this goes back to the conversation we were having earlier about the diversity of voices and different tenants and residents in this sector, that we're really conscious of. And it is absolutely our aspiration to try and reach a range of different tenants at a range of different voices. And we're aware that we will need to do that in lots of different ways. Not one size fits all doesn't work for everybody. And Leslie was saying, you know, earlier that the power of the virtual environment for engaging some people, it hasn't worked for all people, but it has really worked for some people. And we're aware that, you know, for example, written material works for some people, really doesn't work for other people. So we'll need to change and look at the different ways that we're engaging. And I think we're aware that we're at the start of an early journey for us. This is new for us. We haven't engaged tenants in the regulatory regime as part of the Regulator of social housing. So it's important that we stand back and we really look at how we do this the right way. And we are spending that time trying to design that and increase our understanding and our capacity about how to do that. And we're going out there and we are talking to people about these kind of issues, because it's not an easy issue to resolve, and we're really conscious of that. And there is no one kind of perfect answer here. So yeah, all I can say, we're in listening mode. It is absolutely our aspiration to do that, and we'll try a number of different mechanisms along the way to try and make that work. Okay,
I'm going to go into, because I'm aware we're pretty short on time. Before I do that, I'm just going to go to Leslie to say one thing, and then we'll go into the quick fire things.
Okay, I think that one of the things going on from what Anna was talking about is that when your landlord is being flagged up as being, you know, in regulatory measures, the issue is that as a tenant, you don't have a choice to then change to a different landlord. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of frustration in the sector that if you happen to be with a landlord that is not doing what it's supposed to do, it seems like it takes absolutely forever to have that turned around. So if you're living with mold or you're living with substandard, you know, repair service, yeah, it's fine to have your landlord named and shamed, but when is it actually going to make a difference to you as a tenant? And it's one thing to kind of name and shame, but you know, it's there seems to be a long time between you know, having that and then actually seeing a difference on the ground.
I think that's right, and I think that's also inevitable. I mean, from our experience as a regulator, we very often go in because one particular issue has arisen. We never end up just talking about that one particular issue. More and more issues often arise as you go and investigate. And that means that it's quite a complex environment then that we need to instigate change. But I do think that one of the things that we'll need to reflect on as we design the regime and we think about the role of the regulator, but also the role of landlords, is how that is communicated to residents so they can understand what's going on. You know, very often we'll create an action plan with a provider, and we'll need to think about how we involve tenants within that as well, so that whilst we can't change the fact that very often it does take time to change some of these things on the ground, but that people understand what is happening and when they can expect that change to take place.
Yeah, I mean, I think managing expectations is a huge thing. Yeah.
Okay, quick fire. We've got a little bit of time. We're going to go really quickly through, and yes or no answers are okay, Anna, as well. Tenant satisfaction definitions. There's going to be a consultation later in the year, so see that space.
Yep.
Okay. Next one. Aren't we going round in circles? I guess the point here is that a lot of this, there's a lot of comments coming in, a lot of this has been done before. There's a lot of good practice that's already out there as well. No need to reinvent the wheel. Are you going to be looking at a lot of existing good practice for engagement?
Absolutely. We don't want to reinvent the wheel when it works. We want to keep that stuff and just change the stuff that doesn't.
Great. Next one. Budget. Check-in review of information. I think the reference was there to 1,621 landlords. I take your word, Alan, on that, on the numbers being accurate. But obviously, you've got a lot of landlords. Presumably, your resources are to check across everyone.
Yes, so it is to check everyone, but we will do it based on risk. So we'll focus in on the risk, because we just won't have the capacity to be across everyone in exactly the same way.
Great. And then this probably falls a little bit outside, but obviously there's lots of definition, lots of references to the definite affordable housing, and affordable not perhaps being affordable to many people. Is that a question for a debate for another day, do you think?
Probably. It's also probably a debate for government rather than the regulator, in that we work with what we're given in that space. Yeah,
well said. Something that I guess we can say is that we know that.
Darren, I think one of the questions too from James is the net carbon zero. Will the regulator be looking at this area as part of the overall remit as well?
I'll answer that as well, because I think there's going to be a review of decent home standard, and the decent home standards are going to have to incorporate net carbon zero and the broader decarbonisation agenda that BEIS has got on. Is that right, Anna?
That's right, and decent homes compliance is part of our consumer standards. So if it makes it into the decent home standards, it will come into our regulatory standards.
And is that going to be covering local authorities from now on as well?
I think we have to wait and see what the review of the decent home standards comes up with, but it does include local authorities at the moment.
And then the final one, when we speak about tenants and residents, is there a difference? I think there's a difference as part of the white paper, specifically the consultation, in that they refer to tenants being people who are renting. And residents includes anybody who is living in landlords that are regulated. So it therefore extends to leaseholders, shared ownership properties. Is that correct, Anna?
You're testing me on what the government put in the white paper now. I think that's right, but I think it's also worth saying that from a regulatory perspective, in law, we don't have a remit over leaseholders. Obviously, we have a role in governing the governance of the entire organisation, which has an impact on leaseholders. But in respect of consumer regulation, we don't currently have that remit.
I should probably point out that the white paper is broader than that, so it incorporates things like the Housing Ombudsman service, which does, within its remit, include leaseholders. So I'm going to bring that to an end. So thank you very much. That's really great. Leslie, social media. Do we want to promote anything on social media?
Yeah. So everyone that logged in today, thank you for coming. What we would love you to do is to be able to sign up to our mailing list. So, and then when you actually sign up to our mailing list, what you can do is put areas of interest. So if you're interested in, let's say, leaseholder, or you're interested in national you know, getting involved on a national scale, or if you're interested in repairs and maintenance. So then we can, things that are coming up, we can tag you in and get you involved in. And then we can, if you follow us on social media, and you can also follow me as well, that you'll find out what we're doing. We're trying to increase our social media footprint, and also being able to, you know, we're happy to have you pass them on to your organizations and your other tenant groups, to be able, for us to be able to invite you to more events like this, and then other things that are coming on, because we're working also with the Ministry of Communities, Housing and Local Governments, the MHCLG, as well as the Ombudsman, and, you know, things that are coming up and things that we're hosting. We're going to be having a follow-up session on the 9th of June. I know several of you have already signed up, but you can also email me or text me or tweet me or tweet at TAROE, and you can get a hold of us. So thank you for your support, and, you know, we're hoping to be able to provide many more opportunities like this, and also maybe some up and coming training and stuff like that to keep you guys informed. So is that, have I covered everything in like 2 seconds, Darren?
That's great, Leslie. Thanks ever so much. So look forward to meeting welcoming a number of you again at the 9th of June to our next session in this series. A massive thank you to Anna Furlong for joining us today and delivering the session. Big thank you to Leslie for all your support as well. And thank you to all the attendees that came and joined today. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.